you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor and I'm joined, as ever, by the irreducible Ian Hardingham.
Hello, Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I'm going to try very hard to not get fired for comments made by me on this week's podcast.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Windows 10 continues to have lots of lovely surprises as it emerges that the operating system may automatically check your installed apps and connected hardware bits and disable any that it thinks may be pirated or counterfeit. Apparently these checks will be limited to Microsoft apps and services, but the service could be expanded if it's found to work. Ian Hardingham, is disabling your hardware crossing a line?
Yeah, I think it is. I can't be the only person that's just overcome with this massive feeling of fatigue every time I hear about Windows 10 or indeed any new version of Windows. I get so used to using Windows and it's so important to my life and it's so important to people who buy my games' lives, and now I have to listen to the terrifying entity at Microsoft tell me what their vision for my future is, and I don't really have any faith in them. This has been something that they've muted for a long time. There's been attempts for hardware-level anti-piracy measures for as long as I've been an adult of any kind. And back in the olden days, people were massively against it, and there was all this weird stuff that was on the motherboard, etc. I'm too old to get excited enough to say this is the thin end of the wedge, that this is the slippery slope. I don't think this is going to have much of an impact on my life. What do you think?
I'm kind of with you. I think every time that something like this happens, there's a DRM thing or there's some kind of hardware intervention-based protection, normally enough fuss is made, and this is a very selfish thing to say, normally enough fuss is made by the people who care that it's self-limiting. And I agree with you, it's not the thin end of the wedge. I don't think this kind of thing is ever going to become commonplace because the people who use PCs generally still want to have control over their PCs.
Yeah, and the simple fact of the matter is that whenever people try and do things like this, it usually doesn't work properly, so they have to end up disabling it anyway. It's all very well wanting to have this level of control, but when you have all those hardware manufacturers trying to work with each other, trying to work with Microsoft, you get a situation where it just doesn't tend to work. The only problem is, the thing that sort of still makes me wake up occasionally in a cold sweat at night, is that Microsoft are not unable to do truly disastrous things. Windows 8 and Games Windows Live were both things which actually caused quite a lot of damage, and I'm always just slightly worried with everything that they announce like this, that they might just do something really terrible. So right now I think you're right that there's enough public feeling out there that stop them doing the really awful stuff, but it's always a looming spectre in my mind.
Well, that's true. I think that the hype around Windows 8, if anyone remembers that, that you could only install games that came via the Microsoft Store, that was the thing that people were saying with a lot of earnestness for quite a long time prior to the launch of Windows 8. And that just turned out to be completely untrue, and it didn't really have any real impact at all. So while I agree with you that they do have the potential to do something bad, I think it's often threatened, but it never happens, and maybe it never will happen.
Well, I think Windows 8 was bad enough even not having done any of that. The new operating system and sort of seeing what they were trying to go for a unified iPad-style interface between both desktops and tablets. Trying to do that was sort of terrifying enough in itself, even without the bad commercial behavior like that App Store stuff. I think it's fair enough for you to say that some of those things didn't end up happening and that people are obviously always going to overreact. And that's generally good for us, as you were alluding to earlier. It's good that there are a lot of people pushing back on all this stuff that could go wrong. But I actually think that Microsoft have sort of had a couple of things which were bad enough that did actually happen. Like the interface for Windows 8 was really bad, and Games Windows Live really made a couple of games that I wanted to play completely unplayable. I feel like we've gone off topic, though. I think this is going to be okay. I'll be surprised if this is relevant in 3 years, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we're just going to hear more of these type of stories, and I don't think they're particularly ever going to turn into anything. Justin Towell from Games Radar went on a trip down the nostalgia hole recently, and in the sepia depths he found a treasure trove of websites for ancient games that somehow still work. Among the list are Sonic Adventure, which was designed to work with the Dreamcast web browser, and Ico, which includes a still functional puzzle game. Which game's website would you like to preserve for eternity, Ian Hardingham?
Well, I feel like one of the first things I did in this business was be involved in a Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun website. When I was at boarding school, I used to steal my housemaster's bandwidth by sneaking into his office and putting my modem jack thing into his telephone line so I could log in and upload all the new information about the still unreleased Tiberian Sun. So I have like a lot of fond memories of that. In terms of other games' websites, I like services. Like I remember the original BattleNet very fondly. I don't have a particularly amazing memory of a specific website.
I think I'm just going to pick out of these, and the one that I like best is probably Sonic Adventure, which is just, if you go to this website, Sonic Adventure from 1998, it is just a very thin column filled with incorrectly passed Japanese characters, and a really disturbing, sort of sneering, lecherous Sonic, kind of translucent in the background. The fact that has, think of all of the things from the late 90s that culturally could have stayed preserved. We have this, so I'm going to go for that as the one that I want to be preserved.
I think that's a good choice. Sonic does look like it's a bit unclear what he's doing or is being done to him there. I'm sure that worked fine on the Dreamcast web browser.
I think the slight side point for this, it is quite interesting that these things are still around, and steadily as technology gets phased out, they won't be able to work. I think some of them use Flash and are kind of unusable because they're sort of an old version of Flash. So it is weird. I think there's we're going to have a question about archiving later, a listener question, but it is weird that these things culturally are just kind of disappearing. I guess you don't mind too much because you don't have too much nostalgia for these things.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in some ways they're disappearing so much less fast than everything prior. Get content in games magazines and everything and print that actually has disappeared. I remember sort of 10 years ago thinking how amazing it was that all of this stuff would generally be archived, and now I just never think about it.
It's kind of sad that there aren't that you can't just buy digitally issues of games magazines from the 90s preserved with their original formatting in a kind of modern ebook format. And I guess that's probably because they either get wrapped up into things, like Retro Gamer or the sort of Games TM annual things, or they don't have the original files in a format where that would make any sense. And I do find that sad.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true, and I would love that as well. I just recently had to throw away a bunch of my old games magazines. They were sitting in a box at my parents' house. This is a feeling a lot of people, I think, have gone through, and I was just like, I'd quite like to keep them, but not enough, throw them away. And it's a bit sad to see all those beautiful totems of your youth going into the trash can, but they take up space, and PDFs don't.
Yes, it is traumatic. I try and keep some things, but as always, the sort of tension between the actual space, my desire to look like the kind of person who collects games magazines, and what my wife thinks about my piles of games magazines are all limiting factors on that. So I do admire people, true collectors, who are able to have these massive displays. A community member known as Le Corbeau, which means the Raven, is still writing patches for Dark Engine games, i.e. Thief and System Shock 2, to fix bugs and introduce new features. The publisher of the game, presumably after doing some QA, then makes the patches official by adding them to the live Steam version. It's believed that these patches were created using source code found by accident in an old Dreamcast dev kit. Isn't that the start of Jumanji? This seems to be a result of a long series of happy accidents, but is it a good model for software stewardship?
As someone who is intimately familiar with the process of making games, I think that having someone who really loves a game spend years playing it, understanding it, and making little tweaks to make it better is actually something that's very good. It happens to quite a lot of games now, quite a lot of really big games from the 90s and noughties, and from all accounts it tends to be a really good thing. So I'm really on board with this. I think it's pretty amazing. System Shock 2 is a very old game. The engine is very, very old. It was a game I absolutely loved. And you always worry that the that the modder, or whatever you would call the person in question, is gonna put a bit of his own stuff in and screw some things up. But it just doesn't tend to end up that way. He just tends to do a great job.
This stuff, yeah, I'm really with you on this. I think it's a great situation when people can take on these older projects and fix them so that, generations can enjoy them without awful problems, and particularly fixes that will help them run on modern hardware is great. I think everyone can agree that's good. Obviously, it takes a little bit of kind of general awareness and a bit of kind of relaxation from these publishers to allow the source code out there to let people do that. And it's, this guy had to go through a Dreamcast dev kit or whatever to get there, so maybe it would be nice to see that happen in a bit more of a natural way. My main problem is exactly the same as yours. I don't want people to put stuff in. I don't want people to recover content which wasn't in the original game and then put it back in, which is what happens with the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines patches. A lot of those have recovered content. I do not want recovered content. To me, that is not canon. I want to play the game as it was released, but working.
I do agree with that. I think that even beyond there, a small amount of authenticity is lost when you fix some of these bugs. Let's be honest. One of our favourite things about the whole societal ecosystem of games is the bugs. They're such a great part of this medium that we love, and getting rid of them, while generally good, it sort of seems to just polish off a little of an interesting edge on these games. So I have a slight feeling about that. I almost want them to fix the really big bugs, but not the small ones.
Right, you need a bug committee that approves culturally acceptable bugs to be fixed, which actually hamper gameplay, and then the bugs which add character are left. I think that should happen.
Yeah, I'm just reading through this fix list, and one of the entries is fix an occasional memory corruption bug, and I'm all on board with that. I'm voting yes to that. But then he's also fixed a render state bug that could randomly disable texture filtering if something of a certain kind of art was available on the mission. You see, I'm voting no to that. Anything that doesn't actually break the game or your experience, but produces something really stupid looking that happens very rarely, that's the kind of bug that we need to keep hold of.
He's also added support for raw mouse input. Now, as a non-programmer, to me, I'm imagining someone basically sitting next to the USB port, kind of creating sparks with a battery and some paper clips to generate kind of random data, and he's permitted that. So I'm definitely for that. I'd like to see more games controlled in that way. Earlier this month, Riot said in a statement to the community that they don't intend to create a sandbox mode for League of Legends. Instead, the company believes that the best way to practice their game is to play normal matches rather than trying to focus on specific techniques out of context. Ian Hardingham, sandbox modes, are they a good idea?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting, nay, fascinating topic. So, Riot came out and they said, we want to make sure we're clear. Playing games of League of Legends should be the unequivocal best way for a player to improve. This is such an interesting point of view. They obviously want people to be playing as much League of Legends as possible, as often as possible. The number of people online at any one time is, the higher that number is, the better it is for Riot, and in general for the players. The more people playing, the more easily you can find a game. It's a 5 versus 5 game. It needs a lot of people online to be playing, to get a game quickly, to have the right skill matchmaking, all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, at some point, by being really hardcore about this, they are going to be making some bad decisions. League of Legends is a sport now. It's got millions and millions and millions of players playing any minute of the day, and people want to get really good. There are high prize tournaments, and they want to train. Riot are specifically saying that they don't want you to train except in this one specific way. I think that's interesting and possibly damaging.
So I'm going to come down very heavily on one side of this, and it may not be the side you necessarily assume. I think that this is complete nonsense. I think you have to have a sandbox mode to facilitate exactly what you're saying, the kind of training, because there are these very specific micro things that you have to do in the game. Let me read to you what Riot have said about this, one of the quotes from them. While there are some very real skills one can develop in a hyperbolic time chamber, which is a Dragon Ball Z reference, as show producer Jimmy points out, we never want that to be an expectation added onto an already high barrier to entry. On an individual level, we know this isn't always true. Some just want the space to practice flashing over walls without having to wait at least 3.6 minutes in between. But when that benefit is weighed against the risk of sandbox mode grinding becoming an expectation, we just can't accept the trade-off. To me, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that people use these modes to train for games. You just have to use them. It's just a thing that benefits players. You get content out of it. People make videos. They discover new tricks in the game. People go and play the game more to try and learn the tricks. They have the resources to do this. They should do it.
I'm sorry, Riot, but grinding is already a problem. You've created an online sport. People have to play it for 8+ hours a day to maintain a professional competitive level. You are just saying you want them to grind in a specific way. That quote that you've just given strikes me as being disingenuous, to be honest. I'm not particularly sure that is why they're not allowing this. You've got to grind, you've got to play constantly, and they want you to be doing that in exactly the way that they want, and not spending, whatever it was, 100 minutes trying to flash over a wall. It's like telling Federer that he can't spend an hour practicing serves. He's only ever allowed to play with other people, which I think is not the right thing to do. And also, surely the high level teams can just have private matches which they set up. If your player base can do something, then you should allow them to do it as well as possible.
Right, exactly. You made my next point for me, which is that top teams are going to be doing this all the time. They're going to be trying to set up these situations in a stupid and cumbersome way by having people play in a normal mode and getting into a situation just to allow the one guy who's going to do the move to do the move. So that basically discriminates against players who don't have the team training environment, and that's something that I really, really, really dislike in competitive games. One of the attractions of competitive games that have a big viewership for players is that they can go and emulate the cool stuff they see pro players doing. If you don't have a mode that lets them do that, as in Smash Brothers, you can't play on the same stages as pro players. It's not possible. You have to organise that, set up a match directly. I think that's nonsense. You want people to be acting out the things that they can see on the screen to develop themselves into good pro players to push the scene forward.
It smacks of being too controlling, and I think that the controlling company of a sport or a game often gets itself into massive trouble by trying to control too many aspects of that game. Obviously, you want to control the rules and control where people play, etc. But you need to let the community breathe, and you need to get people to work out for themselves how they want to train and how they want to use this amazing hobby and game that you've created.
Nintendo fired one of their employees recently, allegedly for speaking about the practices and decision-making process of the company without permission. Chris Pranger, who used to work for NOA's localization department, was a guest on the Part-Time Gamers podcast, where he spoke about how Nintendo chooses which games to localize and how fans can sometimes be out of touch when it comes to the overall popularity of the games they like. Fair or foul, Ian Hardingham?
Well, I think it's probably slightly foul. This guy I think he got carried away. He didn't say anything that in itself was offensive or bad, but he was a little bit mocking of some of the hardcore Nintendo fans, which is a no-no. And even without that, I would have thought that working at Nintendo, he should know that Nintendo do not like you talking about their internal business practices. Even saying something as relatively risk-free as Nintendo don't translate games that they do not think they'll make a profit on translating, which is what he was saying. Unfortunately, he said it in a slightly more inflammatory way. Unfortunately, that's what we've come to expect from Nintendo and certainly some other companies. So I'm not surprised, but this guy is very sad about it. He has loved Nintendo all of his life. He sounds like a massive fanboy, and he's just been fired for making what I think is a bit of a sophomoric mistake. So I think it's an interesting reflection on how Nintendo are still very, very closed, very high-walled, and how it can affect a normal person.
Yeah, I agree with everything there. I mean, this guy's got an enormously hard time on the internet from people saying, it's obvious, oh, you shouldn't do that. It's funny how a lot of commenters on the internet sort of immediately assume that everyone should know absolutely everything about their professional role and be perfect. There's kind of weird sort of, I don't know, but I think people look up to people in the games industry so much, they sort of assume that they're going to get everything right and then damn them when they get something wrong. I mean, I do agree with you. It's not a good idea to go into public and talk about sort of things that are very personal to your employer. That Nintendo do kind of have to make these quite complicated decisions about the products that they localize. It must be something that they have to analyze a lot, and so, you know, having someone speaking against the party line is really, really bad for them. I do understand why they're annoyed about that. I mean, I think culturally, firing someone for this kind of thing, most of us would think that was an overstep, but again, it's in many ways it's their prerogative. So I think this is a really sad situation, and it's a shame that that's, you know, such a terrible thing has befallen this guy from making what is a mistake, but an easy mistake to make, I think.
Yeah, he's relatively young. He has a family, but I think he's in his mid-20s, possibly late 20s, which may be not that young, but let me finish my point anyway. Everyone makes mistakes. I'm sure that pretty much everyone makes a mistake professionally, and what really sucks is that when you get fired from the only job you've ever wanted, with the only company you ever wanted to be at, or if you think about sportsmen, where they make a big mistake and they are no longer able to play in the only league that they can play professionally in. It's really tough, and I think it's another aspect of something that we've been talking about a lot recently, which is the new age of the internet and how everything is recorded and everything is dissected massively. And you only make one mistake in an arena which in the past might not have been picked up on by a lot of people, and now every single person on the planet will see it for 10 minutes and they'll make their little vote about whether they think that's okay or not, and if it's not okay, you're sold out of luck. So we have to be really careful, I think. When you get above about the age of 16, which seems to me the age where people stop viewing your actions as kind of really mitigated by being young, and you are now responsible for your own actions, you can make life-changing mistakes really easily.
Yeah, absolutely. ZeniMax Media, owners of Bethesda and id Software, have been allowed to continue their lawsuit against Oculus. They allege that the help and advice that John Carmack gave to Palmer Luckey while working for id was illegal, in that knowledge and trade secrets belonging to ZeniMax were used to create the company without proper permission or compensation. Not commenting too specifically on this case, do you think that the law around this sort of thing is preventing useful technological collaboration?
I don't know. I'm pretty against patents in the States when it regards software. Patents were originally created so that when you are making something, the process of making it is hard or secret or took a lot of time to come up with. The idea was that governments would want that information to be public as soon as possible. If you are the only person who knew how to make something and you died, then it would be bad for society that that information was not in the public domain. But of course, you wouldn't have released it because it was an important part of your business. So the patent system is built around giving you a period of time where you have exclusive use of something in return for you giving the information of how you made it. Now, I have no idea how that transfers to being able to patent the idea of dragging a GUI element from left to right. It seems to have stopped being about the process of creation and started just being about patenting ideas, which I'm just in general really against. Now, of course, if you spend a lot of time working on something at one company and you leave to work at another company or set up another company, then I think your original company may have some recourse for the time that you spent under their payroll developing ideas and stuff that you will use in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be very specific to the situation, so there'll be contractual things involved, there will be events and times and so on involved that we don't know yet because the details of the case aren't particularly public. So I think that effectively there is a culture around this stuff where people are tied into quite elaborate legal agreements and they can't sort of have a conversation with someone else without fear that, you know, something like this is going to happen. Their sort of overarching company is going to swoop in and take control of everything. There are weird instances where just because someone's been working on something in a particular company, that company then owns it, irrespective of whether they contributed any resources to it or whatever. And it's just, to me, it's it's just a sad artifact of the age that we live in. I mean, you talked about the patent system that was designed for a particular purpose. I think contract law originally existed around some specific purposes and now has been stretched to its absolute limit by the kind of constraints that people do put on and want to put on their employees.
Yeah, we're all spending more of our time being innovative now. The internet has allowed people to spend a lot of time thinking about starting their own business, or just think about making an interesting Twitter feed. You know, a lot of people who have day jobs are doing creative, enterprising, innovative things on the internet, and the law has got to change, because it's ridiculous to think that your overall employer, if you work for BT or someone, would own your Twitter feed because you spent half an hour at lunch thinking about it. You're right, we have to move on from that, basically.
This is the beginning of the cyberpunk dystopia where corporations control everything and they own you and they own your thoughts that you have in your spare time. I read this article about people who work at Amazon recently, and that it's just expected there that you will answer your email at midnight, or you'll get a phone call from your manager 5 minutes later saying, you know, why haven't you answered this email? Corporate culture like that, where everything is entirely owned by the employer and the employee basically doesn't exist as a person, I think is wrong. And it would be good if there was some way of trying to have some more common sense practices in various industries.
Yeah, not to get too political, but this is what governments should really be for going forward. They should be there to limit corporations having the wrong kind of power. As I mean, you say it's the start of this dystopia. I think we're a little bit further than the start. The huge corporations have an absolutely insane amount of power, and we need our governments to protect us from them.
Good Lord. Keith Stewart wrote an article for Eurogame at the weekend in which he posits that games are now too important to be dismissed as merely a hobby. He feels that the word is too restrictive and that there are now lots of games in which the act of playing them doesn't resemble anything like a hobby. Is Keith being unfairly dismissive of hobbies here, Ian Harding?
I had a disconnect with his definition of hobby. When I refer to something as a hobby, it tends to be something that I am doing in a sort of more hardcore way than that thing is normally done. So I think he sort of said that we would never call cinema a hobby, and I disagree. I think a lot of people go to the cinema, and I think it becomes a hobby when you spend a lot of time around going to cinema doing other things related to films. You know, if you collect aspects of films, maybe if you write a blog about it, something like that. That is hobbyism to me. So if you just play Call of Duty when you get home from the pub at night, then maybe you're not a hobbyist gamer. But if you spend a lot of time collecting consoles or commenting on websites or thinking about games, then I would say that was a hobbyist element. So to me, that's what a hobby is. It's not something that you sort of denigrate an entire medium by calling it a hobby. A hobby is a way that some people interact with a medium.
I think that this is sort of the ultimate semantic argument. The fact that you are kind of using a sort of fairly subjective definition of what a hobby is, and Keith is using his own subjective definition of what a hobby is. He eschewed the idea of kind of going to literal dictionary definitions in this piece, which I think is a good thing. You see in the comments, a huge kind of explosive comment thread on this where people were frantically trying to define what a hobby is. The reason that I think that I overall agree with him is that he's trying to say that games are a medium, and that's fine, and there's been a big battle around whether or not that's true, but games being a creative medium is something that should be established. So I believe games are a medium, and I think playing games can be a hobby in the way that you described it. Someone who plays a lot of games, they collect games, they comment on games, for them it is a hobby. The problem with the word hobby overall is that the word hobby is about my personal ownership of a practice or an idea, and I think that's what he's resisting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree, and I think it has been established, certainly in my mind, that gaming is a medium, and I think we can probably move on from that. We can probably focus, though, on why a lot of gamers are so resistive to that idea, as if by becoming more mainstream as a whole, something is being taken away from them. Well, if you are the guy that spends 30 hours a week playing a specific kind of very weird Japanese genre and does the translation himself and writes a wiki about it that's read by 4 different people, then nothing has been taken away from your hobby because gaming as a whole has become mainstream. Gaming becoming mainstream puts more money in and it allows for more weird niches that people who want to can disappear into. So I'm a little bit surprised that people are so alienated by this idea.
This really goes to the whole identity argument that surrounds all of these issues, and yes, the word gamer and everything like that. So a lot of the people who are very staunchly saying that games are just a hobby and it's obvious, and anyone who's saying anything else is pretentious, are the people who really want to maintain their ownership of games as an idea. So they're people perhaps who have turned to games to provide something in their life, some support in their life that they need. They really value the culture around games that they can talk about with their friends, and they want that to be something comfortable and something that they readily understand. And I think people talking about games as art, different types of games coming out and being praised that they don't like, are all threats to that idea. So the rallying call of "you can't take our hobby" is something that's quite common in those circles. Now, I don't think that the games press has done a particularly good job of negotiating the progress games have made out of being just a hobby, and I think that there's been a lot of alienation of that group. They haven't done themselves any favours either.
Yeah, I think there's been a huge amount of alienation, and I think it is important, as you've just said, to be clear that a lot of people have behaved in a very bad way while responding against this kind of thing. But a lot of ink has been spilled talking about how the gamer is dead and all this sorts of nonsense. I don't think you have to get rid of the old to usher in the new in gaming, and I can understand why people are upset about that. And I agree with you. I think that maybe a more even hand would be nice from some of the bigger journalists.
I think the problem is that the kind of existing idea of which this hobby is a component has been so entrenched, and people vehemently fight against anything which slightly suggests that that may not be the entirety of the case. So to kind of switch and defend the journalist for a moment, I think that under that level of pressure, where you've been saying something for years and years and years against this tide of resistance, and then a few things happen that make it sort of obviously become more true, I understand why you're going to take a defensive stance and you're going to really kind of go after those people who've been maintaining this status quo for such a long time.
Sure.
Witcher 3 developer CD Projekt Red released mod tools for the game last Friday, but not everyone is happy with them. Surprise, surprise. Apparently they only allow for changes to the appearance and stats of characters and items, but not, for example, new quests or areas of the game. This makes mods for The Witcher 3 much more limited than those for the first two games in the series. They've also said that they don't have any plans to release any more. Question, Ian Hardingham, are developers expected to release comprehensive mod tools these days?
Well, they clearly are expected to by their rabid fan base. Should they be expected to? I don't know. This goes back to modding and games as a platform and how that's getting less common. But, you know, all of the Elder Scrolls games have these massive mod kits that come out 6 months later and turn them into a massive platform, which a huge number of people have a great time playing with. I'm not surprised people are angry about it, especially if the prior two games had great modding kits for them. But then, you know, what more does CD Projekt need to do? They've created an amazing game that lots of people absolutely love, and it's much more console oriented, and the more console oriented you become, the less likely you are to be making mod kits for stuff. So that could be one of the reasons behind this.
We get asked questions about mods and sort of mod support a lot on Visiting the Village, and I think that's because a lot of the people who are really into games get really excited by mods. They get really excited by the potential for mods. They think about making them, and some of them do make them themselves. So I think the problem with mods is that there's this kind of real romantic attraction to the idea of them, and that sort of tumbles over into post-rationalization. So a lot of people who play these games think, of course the developers should release comprehensive mod tools. They should put all their effort into that because it sustains the game, they'll sell more in the long term, and so on and so on. And I think there's some truth in that, certainly are for the Elder Scrolls games, but actually, if you're looking commercially at a direct toss-up between releasing loads of free content and DLC, which they've done, probably the most generous game for free content in recent memory, The Witcher 3. If it's a toss-up between that and doing mod tools, which given the nature of development, it might well be, then you're probably going to pick the extra content.
That's interesting. That's a really tough question for me, and I think that's easily arguable in both directions. You know, free content is great, although I'm always a little bit less excited about that stuff being thrown in after the game has been released. It's fine, it's kind of nice, but it doesn't seem to add to the sort of proper core experience for me. Mod tools, again, I don't tend to play these mods for these modern games, so I find myself a little bit torn between those two things. But it's always amazing when you get a game that is properly modded, and when a huge number of people mod a game, you get some pretty cool things. So I'm gonna vote on modding.
But you've got to think about the different types of users here. Like, I think the majority of users are going to be people who want to sort of think about the extra content coming from the developers, if they think about any extra content at all. I mean, you're not particularly interested in it. A lot of people are, and they like it because it's official content that's, you know, coming out for free, and it makes the game feel bigger, and it's all of this exciting stuff. It gets the game back into the press on a regular basis, whereas mod tools don't necessarily do that. Mod tools are kind of the super long game of this, whereas doing loads of additional content is kind of a new thing, and also it's sort of short-term benefit. This is a very kind of console-based game as well. It's not just a sort of traditional PC RPG, and of course those players can't use mods.
I think that's a commercial argument, saying that it's much better in terms of for the developer to do that kind of free content. And I definitely don't disagree with that. That doesn't particularly compel me to want it more as a gamer. I think that mods made for an awesome modding kit can be a lot more interesting than a new horse or whatever released by the developers' B team because everyone else is on holiday and stuff. And post-release things can tend to be a bit cynical as well, and there's something still very magical about turning a great game into a great editor that you can interact with and have fun with. And then you get into the question of, if it's just better commercially, if sort of 10 times as many people are going to be interested in developer created content rather than them creating the ability for users to make content, does that mean it should happen all of the time, half the time? I think that's a tough question. The developers have spent 3 years or whatever making a commercial hit game, and in some ways it's nice if they then do something less commercial straight afterwards.
What's interesting here, though, is that they know, they probably have the data, and we don't, because they've done these comprehensive mod kits for the previous 2 games, and they said they were going to do it originally for this one, which I do think is bad. Like, I do think it's kind of, well, in fact, the way that they worded it was acceptable for them to then not do it, but it did lead some people to believe that they would. Anyway, so they had this plan in mind, and there must now be a reason why they're not doing it. So I think I'm going to say that they know what they're doing here.
Fair enough.
There's a new console on the crowd-funded horizon, and it has the somewhat familiar name of Ouyi, pronounced Ouyi. In fact, the name isn't the only familiar thing about it, as the Android-based device bears a number of striking resemblances to both the Xbox One, the top grille and the controller, and the PlayStation 4, with its distinctive trapezoidal shape. Thank you, Jimmy. Given that the console is expected to sell for around £45, it seems unlikely that the finished product will resemble these slick computer-rendered images that we've seen on Eurogamer. Ian Hardingham, are Android microconsoles ever going to end?
Not anytime soon, apparently. I like to pronounce this console's name, which is spelled O-U-Y-E, as the Ouyi. Ouyi. A little French there. I think it's awesome that they're making a console that looks like a PlayStation 4, has a console controller that looks like an Xbox's controller, and is called the Ouyi. It's like, why are you taking the 2 most important consoles of the current generation and then naming it after the least important console of the current generation? That is what boggles me most about this.
It's the trapezoid of power. Well, that would have 4 points. My analogy is poor. Is this the Taito Wow Wow of our generation? Because we're in this situation now where sites just will report on anything that is an Android microconsole. It seems to be an end of cycle. This is a Chinese product that, in that part of the world, there are a lot of knockoff electronics goods and consoles which are sort of supposed to look like other things. It's just like, where does it end? Will the tide of this ever end? What's going to put a stop to it is probably a better question.
I want to see microconsoles based on different operating systems. The Android thing has got really boring now. There was a great operating system for my old phone, the Nokia N900. It was Linux-based. It was going to be a competitor to Android. It didn't go anywhere because Microsoft bought Nokia. But I want to see a microconsole based on that.
I think we need Scions to come back. We should have some Scion microconsoles that you can use on your TV.
Great point. Email. Instead of downloading games, I want to download OSs for my microconsole.
Brilliant. Weird as all hell, in fact, 90s tribute act Arcane Kids have put up a series of Sonic the Hedgehog-inspired mini-games, claiming them to be leaked Sega prototypes for the Dreamcast. The games are Make My Sonic, which is an avatar creation thing, Eggman Origin, where you feed Robotnik worms like a baby bird until he is large enough to devour you, Sonic Movie Maker, which I really don't feel like going into right now, and My Roommate Sonic, in which you have to seduce Sonic. Is there hope for humanity, Ian Hardingham?
To answer your question directly, no. To talk about this topic, so these games are great. You need to go online and search for this and play this, especially My Roommate Sonic, a game in which you have to seduce Sonic on the sofa while watching TV is pretty awesome. But what I really want to talk about is that the article on Boing Boing that talks about this makes a really interesting contrast between Mario and Sonic. Now, Mario is obviously the more successful of the 90s platforming heroes. Sonic games have not been very good recently, although I don't want to get attacked by the official Sonic the Hedgehog Twitter feed, which is really quite active online. But they haven't been as good, whereas Mario continues his massive, banal march towards legendary status. But what's interesting is that Sonic has become this really, emo symbol. People are hugely interested in fan art of Sonic, in pornographic fan art about Sonic. Sonic seems to be a much more ironic character to look into in the current culture, and much more meme-worthy than the incredibly boring Red Plumber.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and yeah, Lee Alexander's article on Offworld about this is great, and you should definitely go and check it out. I mean, I'm just looking at this again now, and there's the picture of Sonic Movie Maker, which just has this kind of distorted grass texture, and then there's the yellow, whatever the yellow one is, not shadow.
Oh, the yellow Sonic animal?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's canon. It might be there's something called Sonichu, which we should definitely not go into. But it's like, and it's saying, it's lying on the ground. It says, "Toss the ball, Dad." And, I just can't. They've managed to create something which just, it stultifies the mind. I'm 32 years old. I've been on the internet a lot. I've seen some things. But this is just, it just stops. It stops your brain working, and I think that's what they've gone for. It's a very specific kind of artistic effect, and as you say, Sonic is absolutely perfect for generating that. There's something really weirdly nostalgic. It creates this uncanny, eerie texture. Any inclusion of Sonic in something, and I think it's a good thing.
Yes, thank you, Arcane Kids, for showing me that I still have the capacity to be surprised.
Now it's time to relax and enter the television and film lounge area, the segment of the show which we're going to probably rename every week, which is about television and film. And this time we have a business question. So cord cutting, which is the practice of cancelling your paid TV subscriptions and relying entirely on the internet and free-to-view services, is happening more than ever. Companies such as Time Warner, Comcast and Dish saw the biggest ever quarterly drop in subscribers, losing just over 600,000 viewers over the last 3 months. Ian Hardingham, do you think cord cutting is an important development in our media diet?
I do. I think it's important to look at the numbers of dollars involved here. So the average cable TV contract that people pay every month in both the UK and the US when they have a cable TV contract or a satellite TV contract is $100. That's a lot of money. That's about how much my TV package costs, I think. It's how much several of my friends cost, and it just seems to be about the level that they really want to get from you every month. $100 a month is a lot, especially when you can get Netflix for $10 a month or whatever, and then you can get the Major League Baseball package for less than that a month, and then you can get the football package for less than $10 a month. And it's easy to see why it's really attractive, and I think it's a big problem for these networks. I think it's something that's very attractive to people. I don't watch any broadcast television anymore unless it's a sport that I don't have a specific subscription for. I haven't been exposed to a TV advert outside of a cinema for I think 3 months, and I have no desire to start being again. So I'm really on the side of cord cutting, and if I didn't need to have CBeebies to keep my daughter quiet when I wanted to play Rocket League, I might do it myself.
I think that what's happened was the traditional TV companies just increased the size of these bundles, and they were selling people these huge things, and that's just, a lot of that is about, again, promise. People buy promise a lot of the time, and once you've had one of these bundles or you've experienced one, you realise that there's just huge, enormous piles of crap, basically, and you're watching a very few things, most of which you could get on an on-demand service. So I think by bombarding people with this stuff, they've really alienated people, and especially now when a lot of people don't have the money to spend $100 a month on entertainment, why would you not just get the things that you want for a much cheaper price in a much more convenient package? I also have cut my cord, mostly because the cord doesn't work in my house, so I am sort of fully Netflix only. Literally the only thing I want is to be able to turn on the TV easily and watch the news. Both the streaming news services that I would watch in the UK are terrible, and sort of nothing compared to the ease of their broadcast stuff. So I do miss that from cord cutting, but I miss literally nothing else. I mean, I don't think there's anything they can do to fight back now at this point, really.
Well, I was having a conversation with a friend over the weekend, and we were talking about what services we wouldn't get if we cut the cord, and it's news, and it's also quiz shows.
Yeah.
Which are a massive thing in UK culture. And we've also, as a company, worked on several. And they are not things that Netflix are currently having, but I guess they might do. The kind of low-rent drivel that's on ITV at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, that's the kind of thing that you don't get on Netflix, I suppose, because you can choose to watch something that isn't drivel. It'd be super interesting to see what happens to the people involved in making that.
I mean, I still maintain that the thing streaming services need are channels, and I really don't quite understand why that doesn't happen yet, because it is presumably fairly easy to set up. You just need a linear thing, which is a mix of episodes from your different content. I would put that on all of the time, because I want to be exposed to random things that I'm forced to watch, and I just don't understand why they're not replicating that experience. Why are they not consolidating their new market hole?
So would you be able to fast forward this hypothetical channel, or would it just be very much like a channel on TV?
I don't think you would have to start with that feature. It's something that you could experiment with, but you could start by just replicating TV.
I don't know. I'm going to have to meditate on that and talk to you about that again next week, because I don't know what I think about that idea.
All right. Now it's time for Ian's Magic Corner, where Ian Hardingham discusses developments in the Magic the Gathering metagame. Please take it away, Ian.
Yes, so welcome to this week's episode of Ian's Magic Corner, where I am told by Visiting the Village Magic the Gathering correspondent Tom Richards something happening in the realm of Magic the Gathering, and I attempt to describe it without getting myself too lost. So this week, we are going to talk about the new mechanics in the upcoming Battle for Zendikar set. Now, these mechanics are always interesting to talk about. We've talked about some mechanics of Hearthstone recently on Visiting the Village, and I'm always amazed to just hear what the kind of stuff that are put on cards in these games. So the three new mechanics that have been revealed now, the first is Devoid, where a card has no colour. So this is basically, as far as I can see, one of those things where they just try and make subsets of cards, so they can have synergy between a subset of cards. So there'll be lots of cards which can do specific things to devoid cards, that kind of thing. So that seems relatively boring to me, just another way of having a subset. So Magic often creates subsets by having a particular race of creature. So you might have humans. A creature would be a human, and then there would be synergy between humans. The second is an exciting thing called Ingest, which is whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. And that's important because they're printing a lot of new and reprinting some old cards in Battle of Zendikar, which interact with the exile stack, which is another example of how Magic just uses every single thing it can see for game mechanics. And the third and final one is Landfall. Landfall being a mechanic where cards on the table will do things every time you put a land on the table. Paul Kilduff Taylor, have I bored you terribly so far?
Well, I'm trying to follow this. So I don't really know Magic. The exile stack, is that cards you've discarded or used?
That's actually a different kind of stack. So you have a discard pile.
Okay.
Well, not a discard pile. You have a graveyard, which is where cards go when they are dead or used up. And exile was meant to be basically a new discard pile because they put so many weird mechanics on the graveyard, they needed somewhere else where they could just put cards that couldn't then be interacted with by all the cards that could interact with the graveyard. But then, of course, because they couldn't help themselves, now they've got a lot of things that interact with the with that one.
It's amazing. It just like, because I only know Hearthstone, it really is just like Hearthstone cubed. It's just like I can really see where the simplifications came. Okay, so Ingest forces you to exile cards, correct?
It forces the opponent to exile cards when you do damage to them, which I mean, Tom, our correspondent Tom, has said that he thinks that Ingest and Landfall and this card Oblivion Sower, which when you play it allows you to take any land cards in your opponent's exiled place and use them as your own lands, could be potentially broken. There could be a combo deck based on that. Oblivion Sower is quite an expensive creature. It's 6 mana, I think, so it's quite late game. This all seems like pretty big metagame stuff, but I always like looking at what new mechanics they're bringing in and what mechanics that they are no longer using, just because I find Magic so insane.
Yeah, I agree with you on the Devoid thing. Like, just adding those kind of classes is never really interesting to me, and Hearthstone has a sort of light-ish version of that sort of types, and I just like, it just seems like this bland kind of mechanical thing, and they do a lot of this sort of unnecessary building work of adding kind of little features like that. I'm not a big fan of this. This Ingest thing does sound interesting because, as Tom points out, it can have this kind of combinatorial effect. You can combo it into these potentially overpowered combinations, and that's the kind of design innovation I think can be good. The problem is that it's so hard for designers to understand how these things interact with all of the complex mechanics and metagame that they've introduced already. So it seems like that could be quite a big risk for them to put in that kind of mechanic at this point. I don't know. Magic people seem very willing to adapt to the whims of Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, they release new. I mean, they really change things up all of the time. We will keep track of this as Zendikar comes out and as the metagame evolves, and Tom will tell us, and we will tell you guys whether these things actually become important. Just a very short story from talking to him last week before we move on. He has a relatively competitive standard deck, and he was very annoyed because 2 weeks ago at a big Magic tournament, a deck that was like his did extremely well, and that meant that a lot of people were going to start using it, he said, and then a lot of people would also start sideboarding for it and designing against it. So he said that, funnily enough, his deck doing well at this tournament sort of suddenly made his deck less valuable, and he immediately started buying cards for and designing a completely new deck based on that would be good against this projected incoming wave of decks like his, which I think is a really interesting metagame thing to do and I actually sort of respect, and I quite liked.
Wow, that's really awesome, yeah, especially if he's causing these changes. He has power in the world of Magic. No, that is really awesome, and that's a really good... There's something that when you learn a game, actually, that behaviour is sort of very typical of high-level play, where you develop a strategy and then you think about what that will cause and then you adapt to that. That's certainly kind of germane to a lot of high-level strategic games, and it's one of the cooler things. The reason that these silly, complex games are so interesting is that can happen. There's a lot of creative space for people to be able to do things like that.
Yeah.
And now we move on to games that were released this week in 2005, thanks to Eurogamer and Ian Hardingham. It looks to be like the week of Cyberpunk this week.
Okay, so... 19th August 2005. On the PC, we have 2 games that I haven't heard of. And again, I'm badly prepared. I haven't even looked up. We have Neurohunter and Chrome: Spec Force, which I agree sounds very much like they could be Cyberpunk games. On the Xbox One, we have Conspiracy: Weapons of Mass Destruction, which I also haven't heard of, but has a lot of consonants in its name. On the Game Boy Advance, we have Pac-Man World 2, and on the PlayStation 2, we have Sprint Car Challenge. It gives me a feeling of lovely, warm nostalgia to be talking about new releases on these old platforms.
So let's get Pac-Man World 2 out of the way to start with. Like, we had a Pac-Man game last week.
Yeah, I think we did.
We did have a Pac-Man game. It was Pac-Man Pinball on the GBA.
That's right.
So this is just... I'm starting to feel sorry for Pac-Man, because he originally was just a slice of pizza, you know, with a slice taken out, and he was there and he was eating the things, he was going wacka wacka wacka, and then he didn't know that in 2005, which is a long time after his debut, he would still be trotted out for these, you know, low rent, just endless iteration, endless milking of Pac-Man.
This looks like a third-person platformer.
Right.
One of those. Talking of endless, the endless stream of third-person platformers released on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2. I agree with you. I feel sorry for Pac-Man, although I don't like him very much, so I don't feel that sorry for him.
Yeah, he's pretty annoying in Smash Bros. As well. So, although you can kill him with his own fire hydrant, which is kind of the ultimate diss.
Depths of irony.
Right, so Neuro Hunter is a cyberpunk sort of FPS game released by Koch Media in 2005 and did not get good reviews. And I feel sorry again for all these cyberpunk games that came out. I think cyberpunk really, this was when cyberpunk died, and then it came back 5 or 6 years later when we released Frozen Synapse.
That's right.
You know what I mean. It was rehabilitated after this point in time. So that's Neuro Hunter. Chrome Spec Force again is somewhat similar, and again is a very bad sort of FPS cyberpunk game published by Strategy First on the PC. So not a great week for PC games. Conspiracy Weapons of Mass Destruction on the Xbox is something that I feel like we should have looked into more, because I'm looking at this Eurogamer review, which is 1 out of 10.
Oh.
And the final paragraph is, "We're sorry, we're so sorry. This game is just horrible." It's a parody of the genre and a parody of the PS2's abilities. A weapon of mass destruction for any gaming audience unfortunate to play it. That it's not an intentional parody is the only conspiracy present here. So
that's quite a paragraph, Paul Taylor.
I feel like we need to go into this more. Yeah, that was Corey Brotherson's review on Eurogamer on the PS2 version, which is in fact this version. Yeah, Conspiracy Weapons of Mass Destruction. I feel like I need to check it out. In fact, this is the Xbox version. Oh well, that's very important, I'm sure. On the PS2 Sprint Car Challenge, I mean, is this just a vacuum of content?
Yeah, I'm really underwhelmed and uninspired by summer of 2005.
Let's get out of it. We're going to do the top 10 UK Steam games now, because we've decided to broaden out into the top 10 to get some more interesting things in. So let's go. Number 10, Shadowrun Hong Kong. Number 9, Rocket League's DLC, Supersonic Fury, which is a pretty cool name. Number 8, The Witcher 3. Number 7, H1Z1, or Z1 if you're American. Number 6, MGS 5. Number 5, Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. Number 4 is CSGO. Number 3 is GTA 5. Number 2 is Ark Survival Evolved. And number 1, once again, is the all-conquering Rocket League. What's the most interesting game out of this 10, Ian Holliam?
Well, it's interesting to see that Final Fantasy can still do decently when it's released. Shadowrun, I think, did a lot better commercially than I was expecting at any point during its Kickstarter or its development. It seems to be a very solid game. It got sort of mid to high 80s everywhere. It's kind of a game that I keep wanting to pick up, although I think it's just slightly too linear for my RPG tastes. But that really seems to have done really well.
Yeah, Shadowrun, they did kind of push it over the line. It had some problems when it came out sort of initially, and they really kind of kept working on it, kept grinding it away, and it's a pretty cool game. It's a pretty good game.
Apart from that, this seems like a bunch of big names, and Rocket League is still great, and I'm still playing it every day, and I'm still loving it. It is the honk honk ball game, as my daughter calls it.
The honk honk ball. They should have called it that. Yeah, it's a great game. I am still playing it. I did say previously I didn't want to get better at it. I now slightly do. I've been playing some ranked duels, which is kind of an odd mode to play. I quite like the duel mode. You get some kind of funny, tense situations in there. It's not the ideal mode because you can't cross, of course, which is a
Is that one-on-one, is it?
It is one-on-one, yes. You can't center the ball meaningfully. Like, you have to kind of be on the end of your own passes all the time, which is kind of interesting. But I'm playing it because you hit the ball more, so it gives you more chance to actually practice kind of hitting the ball in an interesting situation. But that's fun, so I want to see kind of where my rank is. I'm not much of a fan of their ranking ladder system. It's not very transparent. You don't know where you are. There's kind of big categories. I'm in bronze, obviously. It's the worst, but I don't really understand that. So clearer rankings, please.
I don't even know. Yeah. I haven't actually seen which class I'm in, so that is pretty unclear. One last thing from this list of games. I'm still surprised that Counter-Strike Global Offensive is in the top 10 every single week. That's just really great and really surprising to me.
I think it's just now been entrenched, the esports community really keep it going. I mean, there's huge CSGO streams on Twitch every day with sort of 60, 70,000 viewers. So there's a lot of people watching this game, a lot of people into it. It seems that they've done a solid job of the update now, and they've got people to finally adopt it.
Yeah, I'm really, really pleased. Counter-Strike is just one of like the greatest games of all time, and I'm so glad that it's a professional game now.
That's the end of that. Now it's on to your listener questions, but we're going to start with one from a listener who I know quite well, whose name is Ian Hardingham.
Right, so a lot of my greatest inspirations come when I misunderstand something. And I was on Twitter last night, and I saw an advert for a game that was called something like Minute RPG versus Desert Warriors. And I loaded up the website for it, and I thought it was a game that had taken the RPG map of one game and literally combined it with the RPG tactics combat of another game. And I just put those two things together. And it turned out in the end that it wasn't that. But I was inspired, and I was like, well, there need to be more games like this, because some games have really cool map level RPGing, and some games have really cool tactics level RPGing, and I think you should just put them together, and you should call them Versus. I think Versus was a really good idea for that naming convention, and I want to see it happen.
So there's been a few things like that. I'm thinking of the kind of, those games where the RPG combat was Bejeweled and stuff like that. There's been a few things that are kind of in this genre.
Yes.
I think people don't do it because they want to make new stuff. That seems like designers are quite wary of just being like, this is X with Y. They get all excited and they want to...
Yeah, I don't think anyone sort of seriously, any professional seriously sort of says, okay, I'm literally going to take this one half and combine it with this other half, because people get delusions of grandeur and want to do something different. I think it's the kind of thing that, a modder might do. But I just think that doing that sort of really literally would create some really interesting games.
There's no reason why, A, you couldn't do it, and B, why it wouldn't work necessarily, because just one thing takes the output of the other thing. So the output could be anything. You could have a metagame, and then it could force you to go and do cycling for an hour, and then the amount that you cycle would feed back into how your squad did. And
it would also help me, as a designer, work out how those things interrelate better, because I'd be able to see what it was like when you got slightly ridiculous sort of things put together like that.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's move on to some external listener questions now. And we have one from Alex Walker, and he says, reflections on Cortex after almost half a year, was the name change worth it? I'm going to say that the name change was worth it. We had to really kind of push the game away from being just a football game, which is what a lot of people thought it was. We also didn't like the name anymore for a variety of reasons, one of which was all the jokes that people made about it. Being honest, it's annoying to have jokes about your game's name overshadow people talking about the game, even though the jokes were funny for about 10 minutes. I felt like it's worth it, and I'm happy with the new name.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I really hated the name, and I like Frozen Cortex. It's a nice name. And it was a whole lot of faff, and maybe some of that stopped me focusing on some other aspects of the game that could have done with improvement. But yes, it was worth it.
Alex Connolly asked, what is the answer to game archiving for historical purposes? See, I knew it was going to tie in eventually. Given ownership and hardware compatibility issues. It is pretty difficult. I guess the best thing like this that exists is probably good old games, which a lot of it obviously is predicated on emulation. There are also people who are very dedicated to old hardware. The National Computer Games Museum and the National Video Games Archive in the UK both do a lot in terms of trying to preserve hardware, show it to people, make new people get excited in hardware. Arcade games are very difficult. There are very few people who maintain original arcade games, so it's difficult to get the expertise to do that. That's kind of an interesting area. I don't think there is a single answer. I think it's difficult. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't have any particular thoughts. I agree with all of that. It's getting easier. The way that computer game systems are going, everything's going to be able to be bought online anyway now, so it's going to be a lot easier from this point forward. In terms of in the past, obviously, yes, we need to have emulation, and we need to have museums that specifically get old consoles in the perfect condition with the cartridge possibly glued into the console so you can go and play these games. Emulation is okay for the sort of the majority of game archiving when you don't actually need to see the fully authentic version. obviously we want to see this done, and just like any other kind of archiving, it's going to require sort of charitable organisations to do it properly, I think.
Onyo Mitch says, what do you think about indies offering extras with their games, like the Volume ebook that just came out, and will it become a trend? There's a few different things here. One of them is that extras only really work for your game if your game is a big hit. If your game is sort of meh or rubbish, people aren't going to want to buy the plastic model of your face that sits on the desktop when the eyes light up every time someone scores a point in the game. So you're kind of doubling down on your game being a hit, developing all this stuff. Having said that, if it's something like an ebook or a making of documentary or something like that, then people do enjoy those things. I think it's difficult for indies who want to focus on making their game and releasing it to do all of these extra things, but in the current climate as well, having extra value added stuff that people can buy to give you more money is generally a good thing. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll start off by being boring and saying that, you know, I would rather work on an extra, in inverted commas, which is an extra game mode or something, or you know, some extra little thing that adds a tiny percent chance that your game's going to cross the line from good to great, than spend too long worrying about this other stuff, like ebooks, etc. We're certainly sort of wider, sort of comic books and stuff. I personally don't like particularly. I think that you should be putting all of that artistic energy into the game itself, and you can worry about making a comic book for it after it's a massive success, which is kind of what you were saying. On the other hand, I think that you should always try and innovate. So while I don't think that packing in a comic book with your game is particularly innovative anymore, people should keep trying to innovate on new things that they could pack in that might be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, obviously designers saying that they want to do more design is the most inevitable answer ever. I think that the problem with that is that the optimum time to do this stuff is at launch. People get most excited for the game in the first few days when it comes out. The people who are really, really, really excited and want to buy all the stuff will be doing that at that time, and it kind of becomes self-perpetuating. If your stuff's really good, if someone buys the Volume ebook and they really like it and they really like kind of touching the laminated pictures of Mike Bithel's face, then they might show it to someone else and be like, hey, this is beautiful, this is a wonderful ebook. So I think that that's true, but also you do need to, if you're going to do this stuff, you have to do it big and you have to do it early.
Yeah.
Ding. Tiny Angry Crab says, would you describe Smash Bros. Melee as the Sistine Chapel of games? And given that your answer is yes, why? Now, unfortunately, I've never played Smash Bros. Melee properly. I do have it, thanks to friend of the show, Malakian, and I do have a GameCube to play it on. I've fired it up a couple of times, but because I don't have any friends and there's no online multiplayer, I can't really kind of experience the joy. I mean, certainly from what I know about Smash 4 versus, you know, and Brawl versus Melee, and having watched quite a lot of Melee, Melee is certainly a better game, in inverted commas. There's more creativity that's available to the player, there's more high-level techniques that you can use, it's more exciting, it's not based around some of the kind of quite irritating forced defensive mechanics. But the Sistine Chapel of games, I don't think I'm going to go there. Do you have a Sistine Chapel of games?
I need to ask a question first. What is the Sistine Chapel of?
Chapels.
Chapels, okay, right. So it's like an awesomely beautiful, very holy version of a chapel.
It's the Sistine Chapel is the most famous, contains some of the most famous works of art.
No, I know what it is. I'm just trying to work out what... You know, are we saying the best game of all time? Are we saying the most beautiful? Are we saying
well, yeah, no, I think it's
the most reverential?
We're saying yes, the most artistically revered, the ultimate craftsmanly. Words have started to fail me at this point.
Okay, I think it's probably Quake 2 on the N64.
Steve Yorkshire says, if 3 years was too long dev on Frozen Cortex, what's the cunning plan for faster dev turnaround? Well, we're doing a bunch of things to do stuff faster.
Yep, we're trying to make games at the moment in a year, a little bit longer than a year, mainly a year. And I think, in general, we're just using all of our experience to work out what areas tend to take far too long and cutting those out, and possibly being a little bit narrower on features, although I don't think that will translate to significantly different games, I have to say. As a designer working on the early parts of our next game, I found that this new focus on doing things a bit faster has been really helpful to me. It's helped me to focus on the things that I know are the things that need to happen first without spending too long on systems which this isn't the right time for, and will often end up getting cut. So far it's going very well, and it's definitely helping me. But we're 3 months into this project. I'll tell you where we are in another 3 months.
I think the main thing actually is just really thinking about that a lot, like thinking about what things are going to take a lot of time. Tom Francis had quite a good blog post about this actually, where he was kind of talking about how you identify different types of feature and their sort of potential value versus the time they take to implement, and kind of how you figure that equation. So for any developers kind of looking to do stuff faster, I think, yeah, what Ian said, trying to find the big bad holes that you can go into, and also just like having it at the front of your mind, paying attention to it. It's been interesting. I think it's benefited us a lot. We're not ever going to put ourselves under so much pressure that we make something bad. We're very, we have our standards of what we think is okay. So given that, we have that built-in protection, and we kind of just are trying to figure out how to do things faster. Finally, Matt Farthing, aka hot dance music producer Fake, says, if you could port any character from game, TV, books, who would it be, and when will it be confirmed for Smash, please? So I'm going to degrade myself by actually answering this, and I was thinking about this. I would like to port in the actor Brian Blessed, famous of course originally for the TV series Z-Cars, but probably best known to a mainstream audience for his performance in Flash Gordon. I would like to take him and put him in all the Smash Brothers games, but I'd like to replace the character of Wario with him, and then all of his moves are just him sort of laughing, and maybe he could do that thing in Flash Gordon where he flies up into the air on some wings. So thanks very much for listening to the show again this week, and thank you very much for your listener questions. We had a lot of good questions this time. Ian Hardingham, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I want to echo your thanks. I'm very happy to get some halfway sensible questions. Hope to have some more next week, and thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.